Hello, welcome to Ancient Craft. I'm James Dilley. This is the home of Nap Time and Ancient Crafts prehistoric videos. I started doing Nap Time on Twitter, so for those of you who've been following me there, this will be the new home of it. I just think YouTube will be a lot more accessible to people who have made requests that they can watch it in school or show it to people who don't have Twitter accounts. For those of you that are new to Nap Time following on YouTube, make sure you subscribe. I'll be adding lots of content, flint knapping videos a bit like today's, and lots of other craft videos, bronze casting, firelighting, you name it, it'll be on there. Today's video, although it comes under the nap time and I have said flint knapping, it's not actually going to be about flint, it's going to be about glass. Some of you might know that you can work glass exactly like flint, and for many of you that might come as a surprise, but actually glass and flint are made of almost the same material. Silica, one of the most abundant materials on the earth. Of course, silica is a modern product, but people in Australia were using glass that had been acquired from some of the first Europeans to make beautiful arrowheads and lance points like Kimberley points. So for my first act today, I won't be going into glass snapping, I'll be talking about the safety part of it, and I know that's the boring bit. And again, for those of you that have been following on Twitter, for the very first nap time video I did, I covered this part in more detail, so I won't do it as much today, but just to make sure for anybody new who's joining, you have some idea of the basics to cover. The most important thing for when you're breaking any kind of rock or modern material is to wear a pair of these proper safety glasses, and they can be in this sort of sunglass style or more of the geeky full science lab version, as long as you've got something covering your eyes. Another important safety aspect is your hands, as they will actually be holding the flint or material that you're working on. Many flint knappers around the world today don't wear gloves at all. You will get cuts. Certainly if you're learning, it is very much worth wearing a pair of fairly tough gloves. Leather gardening gloves or these cut resistant sight gloves are really good for that purpose really, and sometimes people just wear one glove in their stone or glass or material holding hand, but I'm going to wear two for today. Funnily enough, one on each hand. I would also recommend wearing a pair of trousers as well, or certainly something covering most of your legs, because the last thing you want is razor sharp flakes going past the inside of your leg, because you've got some pretty vital arteries going through there, so it's worth covering them up. You can see that I'm sitting on quite a large tarp here. This is not so much for your personal safety, but it's more for the archaeological safety. And you might be thinking, archaeological safety? The reason why you want to have a tarp like this is so that you can collect up all those flakes and not leave them scattered about so someone else can tread on them, because that's not particularly pleasant, I can tell you, but so that you can put them in a bucket and either take them to a quarry or a place where they crush and dispose of hardcore, or to a rubbish tip where they go through the same process. Certainly if you're working on flint or another material that was used in prehistory, if you scatter those flakes out into the field, they can be easily mistaken for archaeological material, and that can cause major problems on sites that are surveyed and worked on in the future. So try and collect them up and dispose of them responsibly, and putting them in a crusher or giving them to a facility that can crush them for you is the most responsible that I've found. So I'll get to it really. Glasses on being the main part of that really. It's best to forget that they're there really. How to get the base, which is the easiest part to work with, off a bottle like this. Well, you can see with this other blue bottle that I have here that the base has dropped off. Well, how did I get that off? I didn't cut it. I didn't use a rotary disc cutter of any kind. I used something far more simple. Just a nail or screw really. It's quite a large screw, you don't want anything too small. Nails are usually a bit better, but this was all I could find at the time, and it'll do the job in exactly the same way. You need your bottle. As you can see, I like Ghost Ship, it's one of my favourite beers. Put the nail or screw so it's point down, like so. Put a thumb or finger over the top, and you're about to start gently shaking it up and down. Not too violently, but gently. The reason why I'm doing this is that the point is going up and down and impacting around the base, and you might have just seen a little piece of glass dropped off there. Another piece. I'm just going to turn the bottle around. Another little piece. You don't want to do this too violently, otherwise you can break the whole base. You should get a sound change when the base is about to drop. You hear the sound is really starting to change. You might find the nail or screw gets lodged. And hopefully it'll drop off cleanly into my hand any second. Any second now. Not quite. Put the nail back in. There we go. Not a particularly clean break, unfortunately, but I've still got a good chunk of base there to work with. Now at the moment it's razor sharp and pretty ragged, so the next thing to do is to take a rough stone, that could be a piece of sandstone or brick or even concrete, and just gently abrade the edges or rub the edges to take off that razor sharp edge. You're just far less likely to cut yourself. And you don't need a sharp edge to begin with. So there we go, the base has come off. It's not the best base break I've ever done. Ideally you get the whole base, but there should still be a small arrowhead in this. The next stage is to dress the base before you properly start flaking it. Pressure flaking is one of the key components of flint knapping. It's often associated with sharpening flake tools like spearheads or knives, or making arrowheads. Arrowheads are of course really popular, and I often get asked, oh, can you show how arrowheads are made, or can you teach me to make arrowheads? The problem with arrowheads is the process of making them, pressure flaking. It's not easy, and it can be quite bodily taxing, and you can easily injure yourself as well. But the prize can be, if I can fish it out of my pocket with gloves on, is that you can end up making something like this. Now this is of course a blue glass arrowhead made from that piece of Bombay Sapphire gin bottle that I showed earlier. But even with a glass arrowhead, they're very fragile but require good technique to actually make them. So I'll stick that away for now as the teaser. So the tools you need for pressure flaking, some people simply use nails and they work quite effectively. All you need is something hard with a point to it, either like a screw or a nail. I tend to like using antler tips or the tines. I have two pieces of red deer here. These work really well actually biting into the glass edge, so you can push off the flakes without fracturing or breaking it. But as long as it's something that you can hold on to with a bit of a point to it, again, nail or a piece of antler is fine. But how do you actually use it? Well, I'll draw it first before showing you the holding technique. Now, get to pull out the whiteboard again, my favourite. If we've still got our pieces of glass here, the tip of your pressure flaker, whether it be a nail or a piece of antler, needs to come right up to the edge and actually make contact onto the edge itself. The movement, rather than going directly across or straight downwards, wants to be somewhere in between. Ideally you want to be aiming for the pressure to be going in that direction, because of course you've been flaking in this direction beforehand, and ideally you want to keep it at the same angle, but you're not using percussion this time, or indirect percussion, you are using pressure. If the point of your flaker bites onto the edge, or that it's in a position where you have to push for something to come off, then you're starting to induce that pressure flaking process. Now, it is of course difficult, and it's tempting to do all the work in your wrists, and this is perhaps why glass is a fantastic material to practice on, because it has nowhere near the level of resistance that flint does. I've seen people learning to pressure flake where they've been trying to do the whole process in their wrists, and that can easily result in wrist strain. Whereas at least with glass, it's a lot weaker or more brittle. So when the pressure flaker bites and you push across and downwards, it should start to take little flakes from both sides, if you were to attack this side as well, that will allow flakes to hopefully travel across the surface. And each time you take a flake off, it will certainly be worth abrading it very slightly. I find antler bites into a sharp edge, whereas metal nails or copper pressure flakers prefer a more abraded edge. You just get a better result. So in terms of how to hold your pressure flaker, there's a few different techniques, but I think the most effective, certainly if you're learning, is to hold it in what's sometimes known as a hammer grip. So you've got the point or tine of your pressure flaker poking out of your hand like so, as if you were holding a hammer to use. Now, how to hold your piece of flint or glass? Well, certainly not straight in your hand. I would recommend holding it in a leather pad, and I actually use 3 pads banked up with a small one, so I've got a bit of a ledge to work off, and these 2 pads to protect my hand, because the last thing you want is for the point to dig into the palm of your hand, because with the amount of pressure you build up, that can also lead to injury. If you don't have access to leather, you may have access to some old rubber floor matting of some kind. That works really well too, but anything that's resistant really, or fairly flexible is perfect. So I'll stick with my leather pads, and I'll pick up my worked piece of glass. Now for the edge I'm going to work on, let's say it's this edge, and I'm going to flake underneath. So to continue trying to increase that lens profile, I'm going to hold it in the pad like so, my fingers holding it. I'm going to have the tip of the pressure flaker up so it's flat, level with the flake, and I'm going to hold it tightly. For the back of my palm that's holding the glass, I'm going to keep that butted against the inside or the corner between the upper and side of my thigh. That just keeps it anchored in place, so it can't really go anywhere, so that your arm and wrist isn't having to resist the force of being flaked across and into. For the pressure flaker, I try to keep the butt of the pressure flaker just in the corner of my hip or in lower abdomen. That just means that this side is secured as well, so that when your body comes to do that pressure action, neither the flake of glass or flint or the pressure flake will be pushed out the way. The two will have to go across each other and hopefully result in a good flake. So have the antler butted up to the flake, start to hold it in place, and you'll notice that I'm using my legs and I'm tilting my torso downwards. I'm not using my wrists at all. They are only holding the two in place. They are not building the pressure. Start to squeeze, and you might hear that click as a flake gets pushed off. And each time I take a flake off, all I need to do is slightly move the pressure flaker along. Hopefully see getting a few flakes off. Move position again, squeeze. And as I said, I'm really not using my wrists here. I could almost just let go of it, put the antler in place, and there we go. It's all about bodily pressure rather than wrist strength. You can hopefully see now that I'm starting to get a far more even flaked edge across this side. And you've just got to continue working on the other side, really. You may see pictures of arrowheads where they've got really lovely long ripple flakes that go across the surface, and each flake is more than a few centimetres in length. Please don't expect that of yourself within your first few goes of it, really, and certainly not this stage. You're still starting to dress the actual flake of glass or flint or other stone. Once you've gone round the outside on one side, usually with the concaved side of the bottle pointing downwards, because you're still trying to create that lens or improve that lens, you can flip it over. But at this point I'm still trying to turn it from a convex and a concave side to a convex side and not quite so concave side. And certainly as you're going through the learning process, it's very important to stop and think about how you are reacting in the process. If you find that you're on a particular edge and you're really trying hard and you can feel your forearms and wrists really going for it, something's not right, and the worst thing you can do is keep going, because certainly if you've never really tried this before and you're using muscles you've not used before, that's where wrist strain can come in. So really take your time. I mean, even through me building up pressure then, I could start to feel that strain coming in my forearms, and it's simply because I'm putting far too much pressure in. So once I've gone around the outside, I can flip it over and start to flake on the other side. Before I start flaking on the other side, it's worth using your abrader again, just to lightly take off that razor sharp edge. Antler prefers an edge that isn't so blunt that it can't bite, but it doesn't like an edge that is too fragile and thin. So it's worth taking off that very, very sharp edge. And again, just go around the outside. Very little, just a few seconds all the way around. Done. So you turn the flake or glass over now so that the concave side is pointing upwards. And put the tip of the antler up against the edge, and your material, stone or glass, hold in hand so it's flat against the inside of your thigh so it can't move anywhere. Base the antler nicely anchored. Start to build that pressure up. And try and get a flake off. So these flakes are starting to travel a little bit longer now, and once I've taken a few off, I'll show you. As I mentioned previously, pressure flaking isn't an activity that's only used for arrowheads. I often use it to prepare edges when I'm working on very thin stone tools like daggers or spearheads, because I can change the angle or remove little mistakes that I've made before going for quite a risky thinning flake. So now I've taken a few flakes off, I'll show you what the edge looks like. So hopefully you can see now that the flakes, certainly this one, I hold it so I can point out with the antler, has travelled quite a distance, almost to the other side. Some of these flakes aren't quite so long because I didn't put a great deal of pressure in. I didn't need to at this stage. It's not worth going for really seriously long, thick flakes at this time, because the glass will start to get very, very thin and fragile quite quickly. But you can see with limited pressure, your flake should travel a reasonable distance. And certainly if you'd seen some of the earlier nap time videos, you will have perhaps picked up on me saying that flint flakes or any conchoidally fracturing material, when it flakes, likes to travel over a gently curving surface, particularly one that's convex rather than concaved. And we have a nice convex surface here that's slightly curved, and that's generally why the flakes have travelled a great distance on this side, whereas they won't on the reverse, on the concaved side. So I'll continue going round on the other side. Get a few more of those flakes off. Again, I'm not going for particularly thick or heavy flakes. Just checking every so often. And there we go, so I've flaked all the way around the outside, and you can hopefully see that I've ended up with an almost totally flaked surface now. The next stage is to go back onto the concave side and start flaking through and try to take off the extreme ends of that curve so it's not quite so dished on the inside. So I'm going to start flaking the underside again, and you may have started to realise that flint knapping is a process of stages really. You'll start working on one side then the other, and that's fine. Many stone and flint and glass objects can take many hours to make. Most are a matter of minutes, but many, particularly the finely made spears and daggers, and some of you that are more au fait with your flint work may have come across some of the Danish flint work from the late Neolithic. Some of the beautiful daggers that they have go through many hours, and it's not just flaking. Some of them are ground so that the surface is smooth, so that the final flakes are really long and look good, as well as thinning the dagger down. You may start to wonder, well, what shape shall I go for? Well, there are lots of arrowhead shapes out there really, so sometimes it's a case of what you'd like to make, and sometimes it's a case of which way the flint or glass wants to go, it's sometimes dangerous to have a particular shape set in your mind, because the likelihood is that the material you're working with will change its mind. And as you saw with my particular piece of glass, when I was trying to get the base off, a chunk came off, and a little later when I was working on this piece just to dress it, another chunk came off. And as I'm working on this piece now, hopefully not, but more may well come off. You can see on this piece it's starting to take on a bit of a leaf shape to it, so I'll probably go with that because it's a nice easy shape to go with, and it's the same shape as the smaller blue one I showed earlier. So I can grab my abrader again. Remember to try and abrade it ever so slightly after each stage. Now the convex face is really easy and lovely to flake, and I know it's tempting to continue with that, but you'll end up with a really curved dished arrowhead, which again isn't a massive problem, but I know for the perfectionists out there, they'll be wondering how to avoid ending up with a dished arrowhead, and that's why you need to focus on the concaved face a little more. You may have also noticed that the small blue arrowhead is significantly smaller than this arrowhead. For certainly a British Neolithic or even European Neolithic arrowhead, this is, if I left it at this stage, far larger than usual. We do occasionally get Neolithic arrowheads or points that are of similar size and sometimes even bigger, but they're generally put into a class known as laurel leaves. And they may well actually be knives or spears rather than arrowheads. If you find that the tip of your flaker isn't quite biting and it's scraping off or detaching from the edge before you feel like you've built up enough pressure, it may well be that the edge hasn't been abraded enough. So I'm going to flip back to the other side, quick abrasion as always. The flakes on the ventral face, or this concave face, should start to get longer, and hopefully, as you can see on this side here, the flakes are almost reaching to the middle across here, and at that point you'll start to know that you've almost got it flat. So I've gone round the outside, simply time for another abrasion round. Now at this point, rather than continually going around the outside, you may start to notice areas that need a little more work than others, because one side needs to be trimmed in a little bit more. You can see that this side needs to come in so that it's not quite so wonky, or the outside here needs to be worked on a little bit. And it's a simple case of just working on those areas a little bit more. And it's okay to stop and check as well, and just have a good look and try and work out what's in front of you. If you just keep going at it machine gun style, you can end up with major problems that are quite difficult to undo, or you can realise you were working on an area that you didn't want to, and that you're actually working on the wrong side. I've done it before. I would imagine most knappers have. Now I appreciate as the piece of glass or flint starts to get smaller, it will start to become quite difficult to hold on to, simply because you're putting a lot of strain on your fingers. Unfortunately, that particular part of the process comes with practice and letting your body get used to the process. So don't be too frustrated if you can't hang on to it. A bit like the actual action of pressure flaking and getting longer flakes, it will come with time. If you start to feel you're getting tired, and that's either through leaning over in this crouched position or your arms are getting tired, it's absolutely okay to stop. Don't feel as if you have to force yourself through this process to get used to pressure flaking, otherwise again you can end up injuring yourself. Often when I have to complete orders of sometimes tens of arrowheads, I'll do maybe 1 or 2, then have a break, stretch out my back, and then you just feel a lot more comfortable. Otherwise you'll wake up the next morning and will barely be able to move. So the arrowhead is starting to get there. It's starting to look like an early Neolithic leaf point now. It's not too far away. So I've just got a few rounds of flakes to go, maybe sort out a couple of little issues here and there, and then it's pretty much done. And rather than doing whole edge or whole arrowheads rounds of abrasion at this stage, I usually, as I mentioned before, work on specific areas. I've got a little bit of a stack in the middle where the glass hasn't fractured all the way through, so I'm just taking a few flakes off on the reverse side so that the follow-up flakes will hopefully travel a little bit further. And you may notice that I've lifted it up, so I'm pretty much doing it in my wrists, which is exactly what I said not to do. But I'm not taking full flakes off, I'm just gently nibbling at the edge. So I think that's pretty much ready for the last few rounds of flakes. So to combat these last few flakes, again I need my abrader, but not too much, as usual. Mild abrasion, so that the antler can actually bite into the edge. Set yourself up so you're nicely anchored, build up the pressure with your legs. And there we go, got some of that stack off. So I'm on the last few flakes, it's not too far away. This is the bit where I have to be extra careful, either to not make mistakes or of course snap it, because it is quite thin now and rather fragile. So I've just got a few more platforms that I've kept an eye on. Just got to make sure it's got a sharp point, of course, and that it's reasonably symmetrical. It doesn't need to be perfectly, but the perfectionist in me always encourages absolutely symmetrical sides, particularly for arrowheads. But many prehistoric objects are not perfectly symmetrical, and actually when I have fought my self-perfectionism and it is slightly asymmetrical or not perfect, it just feels a lot more real, like a real artifact. So I'm just checking very carefully if these last few flakes, is it worth going for certain areas or just leaving them. So it's certainly becoming tricky to hold on to at this stage because it's very, very dinky. But I'm not trying to take off any particularly thick flakes so I don't have to build up lots of pressure. Many of these flakes are just shaping flakes. I'm just trying to straighten up the edge a little bit. So I don't need to hold on to it too tightly. So I think that will do. I'm at that point where I could continue pursuing that absolute perfection where the arrowhead has a really nice straight cutting margin, it's absolutely symmetrical, but there's a risk there. There's a risk of overdoing it, making it to the point where it's very, very small, or it could even snap if I continue because it's very thin. So I'm going to stop there, put down my tools, take off my gloves, because then I can't carry on anymore. Gives me a chance to hold this up a little bit better as well. So there is that leaf arrowhead from that brown bottle glass. Now this kind of leaf arrowhead mainly made in Flint in Britain, of course comes from the early part of the Neolithic, around 6,000 years ago. These are some of the earliest invasively flaked arrowheads that we have in Britain. Beforehand, from the Mesolithic, we of course have the gently nibbled bladelets that would be glued onto arrow shafts on the side or into a slot, whereas in the early Neolithic you simply had these that were fitted into a slot. So it's come a long way from this to this. I know it's a lot smaller, but there's an awful lot of material you have to remove. I hope that's been useful and interesting, and for those that are hopefully learning to flint knap, there are a few key things to remember with pressure flaking. Take your time, be determined, and don't worry if you're not getting it straight away and you're not getting long flakes. It takes time and practice to get to the point where you're comfortable with it and that you don't have to keep taking breaks every 10 minutes. And just try and remember that as you're working, you're trying to build that pressure up between your legs and lower chest and abdomen. If you feel that all of that tension is building up in your wrists and forearms, stop and think about what you're doing. Other notices? Well, of course, if you found this interesting, I will be posting more, and next time hopefully I'll be doing Paleolithic hand axes, how they're made and why I think they're really important. And people often think of hand axes when they think of the Stone Age. They're so iconic. And it's a good place to start if people are learning to flint knap as well. I'll be going through a lot of the basics. Other notices, during this lockdown phase, many museums are suffering, and one of my favourites is Creswell Crags up near Sheffield and Nottingham. It's a fabulous site with some of the rarest archaeology in Britain from the Upper Paleolithic, all the way through from the Aurignacian right through to the Creswellian, of course, with Creswell Crags. They also have some of our famous rock art there in some of the caves and rock shelters there, but they're in dire straits at the moment because they have no footfall or income. They're holding a fundraising auction very soon, and there'll be a link in the description. Charles Hanson, the famous TV auctioneer, will be auctioning off artwork by local artists, and I've also donated a selection of flint work and some of my glass hand axes as well. I don't make these very often, they're pretty exclusive. So if you would like to own one, head over to the link below and well, let's see if you perhaps own one of these pieces. But until then, I'm going to sign off, have a break, perhaps drink some more beer so I have a bit more class for some more arrowheads, and get on with some orders and prepare for next week's edition.